At the moment of its greatest triumph, the United States did not feel dangerous. It felt righteous. The war was over. The ruins were smoking across Europe and Asia, and America stood untouched, richer than ever, holding the world's gold, factories humming, confidence flowing like cheap oil. This was not how empires usually ended. This was how they began to believe they were immortal. Here is the uncomfortable truth. America did not set out to create its greatest rival. There was no secret meeting, no grand conspiracy, no single villain signing a fatal document in a candle-lit room. What happened was far more disturbing than malice. It was faith. Faith in markets, faith in progress, faith that power, once achieved, could be safely shared without ever being challenged. Imagine it for a moment. You have won history's most brutal contest. Your enemies are shattered. Your allies depend on you. Your currency is the language of money itself. At that height, every decision feels generous, inevitable, even moral. You open doors not because you are weak, but because you are strong. You teach others your rules, because you are convinced they can never beat you at your own game. And that is where this story truly begins. Not with fear, but with optimism. Not with hatred, but with certainty. The certainty that economics could tame politics, that trade could dissolve ambition, that no nation, no matter how patient or disciplined, could turn America's own system against it. But history has a cruel sense of irony. Sometimes, the most dangerous rival is not the one you fight, but the one you help rise, quietly, confidently, while believing you are still in control. In the decades that followed, Washington's greatest fear was not a single country, but chaos itself. Chaos bred revolutions. Chaos invited ideologies that did not need markets, borders, or consent. To American planners, the lesson of the early 20th century was clear. Instability was more dangerous than tyranny, and poverty was the fastest road to radicalism. Order had to be engineered, even if it meant making uneasy compromises. So, the United States did something unprecedented. It turned its victory into a system. Dollars became anchors. Institutions became guardians. Trade routes became arteries of influence. This was not charity. It was architecture. A world designed to flow toward American power while appearing open to everyone else. If nations grew rich inside the system, they would grow predictable. If they grew predictable, they would grow peaceful, or so the theory went. There was a quiet arrogance buried inside this logic. It assumed that economic behavior would eventually overwrite history, culture, and ambition. That factories would matter more than flags. That prosperity would soften old grievances and dissolve the hunger for dominance. From afar, it looked enlightened. From inside the machine, it felt efficient, rational, and unstoppable. But systems have blind spots. And the American system, for all its brilliance, was built with one fatal assumption: that every participant wanted the same ending. That everyone entered the game to become more like the United States, not to surpass it. While America focused on maintaining order, others were studying the blueprint. Not to admire it, but to learn how to bend it. They learned where the leverage was hidden, where patience paid off, and where power quietly accumulated, long before it ever announced itself. The stage was set. The rules were written, and the mistake was already in motion, long before anyone realized they were no longer the only ones playing to win. The turning point did not arrive with an explosion. It arrived with handshakes, signatures, and polite applause. A decision framed as pragmatic, even noble. Open the gates, bring them in, let markets do what armies could not. This was the moment America crossed a line without realizing it had one. The logic sounded flawless. Isolation had failed before. Engagement, they believed, would succeed where pressure could not. By allowing access to capital, technology, and global trade, the United States assumed it was exporting values along with goods. Factories would teach cooperation, growth would reward moderation, and dependence on the system would guarantee obedience to its rules. But this was not a student asking to be taught. This was a strategist asking to be invited inside the fortress. What America saw as integration, the other side saw as reconnaissance. Every joint venture became a classroom. Every transferred machine became a blueprint. Every trade deal became time bought, quietly, patiently. The goal was never to reject the system. It was to master it faster than its creator expected. This was the fatal miscalculation. Power does not always announce itself with flags and fleets. Sometimes it accumulates silently, in supply chains, in technical standards, in the invisible infrastructure that makes modern life function. By the time the consequences became visible, the foundation had already been poured. In trying to shape the world through openness, the United States had opened something else entirely. A path, a shortcut, a once unthinkable possibility that its own tools, designed to stabilize the world, could be repurposed to challenge the very hand that built them. The door did not slam shut behind this decision. It remained wide open, and what walked through it would take decades to fully reveal itself. What followed looked like a miracle. Cities rose where farmland once slept. Skylines pierced the sky in a single generation. Millions moved, labored, produced, and consumed at a scale history had never witnessed. To the outside world, it was a success story. To investors, it was efficiency perfected. To policymakers, it was proof that the theory worked. Factories began to migrate, not in secret, but in daylight. One by one, industries packed their machines and crossed oceans, chasing lower costs and higher margins. Supply chains stretched, then locked into place. What started as outsourcing slowly became dependence. Entire sectors learned to breathe through a single set of lungs, far from home. The numbers were hypnotic. Growth rates that seemed impossible. Export figures that rewrote economic rankings. A population disciplined, tireless, and increasingly skilled. While Western consumers enjoyed cheaper goods and higher profits, something else was happening beneath the surface. Knowledge was compounding, capacity was deepening, control was tightening, and still confidence remained unshaken. This was supposed to be temporary, a phase. The assumption was that wealth would inevitably demand freedom, that complexity would force political change, that prosperity would soften ambition. But ambition was not softening. It was sharpening. Behind the spectacle of growth was a colder strategy. Learn everything. Depend on no one. Use access to buy time, and time to build leverage. While the world applauded the rise, few asked who was truly gaining control of the arteries that moved energy, goods, and information across the planet. By the time doubts began to surface, the architecture was already in place. The machine no longer needed permission to run. And the miracle everyone celebrated had quietly become something else entirely. A shift in gravity. A transfer of power so gradual it felt invisible, until suddenly it was everywhere. Dependence has a strange way of disguising itself as efficiency. At first, it feels like optimization. Cheaper inputs, faster production, higher margins. But over time, convenience hardens into necessity, and necessity becomes leverage. The world had not just traded with this rising power, it had reorganized itself around it. Entire industries discovered they could no longer function without components made an ocean away. Rare materials, specialized parts, entire stages of production that no longer existed at home. What once looked like diversification had quietly turned into concentration. And concentration, in geopolitics, is never neutral. This was the moment the balance began to tilt. Market access became a bargaining chip. Regulation became a weapon. Standards, once technical and boring, became tools of influence. The rules of the system were still written in the language of openness, but they were now enforced with selective pressure. Obedience was rewarded. Resistance was punished, quietly, efficiently. Meanwhile, in the West, the cost was deferred, not denied. Jobs vanished slowly enough to be explained away. Strategic vulnerabilities were buried under quarterly earnings. Warnings sounded academic, distant, inconvenient. After all, disentangling now would be expensive, painful, politically dangerous. So the system persisted, even as it hollowed itself out. This was no longer a partnership of equals, if it ever had been. It was a trap made of mutual benefit, carefully calibrated, so that only one side could afford to break it. Power had shifted from the visible symbols of strength to the invisible mechanics of dependence. And still the illusion held. As long as goods kept flowing and shelves stayed full, the danger felt abstract. But history rarely announces the moment control changes hands. It simply waits until resistance becomes impossible, and choice reveals itself as something that was lost long ago. The realization did not come all at once. It arrived in fragments. A blocked acquisition here, a stolen breakthrough there, a sudden shortage that no one had planned for. What had once been dismissed as coincidence began to feel coordinated, and for the first time, the question was no longer academic. It was existential. America looked at the board and saw a position it did not recognize. The factories were not coming back. The leverage was not theoretical. The student had not only learned the rules, it had rewritten parts of the game. What was once dependence on the system had flipped into control over it. And control, once achieved, does not need to announce itself loudly. This was the shock. Not that a rival had emerged, but that it had emerged using American tools, American logic, and American patience. Globalization, once a symbol of triumph, now felt like a weapon turned inward. The very networks designed to project power were being used to constrain it. In closed rooms, the language changed. Cooperation became competition. Integration became vulnerability. Trust became a liability. The realization spread quietly but relentlessly. This was no longer an economic issue that could be managed with incentives and dialogue. It was a strategic confrontation that had been years in the making. The climax was not a single event, but a collective awakening. A cold understanding that the moment to prevent this outcome had passed long ago. That the doors once opened in confidence could not simply be closed without consequence. The rival was no longer outside the walls. It was already inside the structure itself. What followed was not war in the traditional sense, but something colder, slower, and far more pervasive. Tariffs replaced troops. Sanctions replaced sieges. Algorithms, patents, and supply contracts became the new battlegrounds. The fight was no longer over territory, but over who controlled the systems that made territory relevant. This was the era of soft conquest. No flags raised, no capitals stormed. Instead, influence flowed through markets, infrastructure, and dependency. If you controlled the choke points, you did not need to fire a shot. You could shape outcomes by withholding, delaying, or redirecting the lifelines of modern economies. Technology became the sharpest edge. Standards determined winners before products even reached consumers. Data moved faster than diplomacy. Entire nations found themselves choosing sides not because they wanted to, but because their networks forced them to. Neutrality became expensive. Independence became a luxury. For the United States, every response carried a cost. Pull back too hard, and the system it built would fracture. Move too slowly, and the imbalance would deepen. Allies hesitated. Corporations lobbied. Voters felt the pain in prices and uncertainty. The confrontation was everywhere, yet nowhere you could point to on a map. This was the price of delayed recognition. The realization that power, once diffused, is nearly impossible to reclaim without upheaval. The mechanisms of control had shifted from the visible to the invisible, and fighting them required dismantling parts of the very order America had spent decades constructing. Conflict had no clear front line. Only pressure, counter-pressure, and a growing sense that the rules no longer guaranteed safety to the one who wrote them. The consequences did not arrive as a single collapse, but as fractures spreading across the global order. Trust eroded first. Allies began to question guarantees that now came with conditions and uncertainty. Institutions built to stabilize the world started to feel outdated, unable to keep pace with a rivalry that lived inside supply chains and financial systems rather than battlefields. The illusion of a neutral, rules-based world faded. Every port, every cable, every investment was reinterpreted through suspicion. Projects, once sold as development, began to look like influence. Loans felt less like help and more like chains. Nations discovered that sovereignty could be compromised without a single soldier crossing a border. For smaller states, the choice was brutal: align and gain access, or resist and risk isolation. The space to maneuver shrank. The promise of globalization as a shared prosperity gave way to a harsher reality. Integration without power meant exposure, not security. The system that once promised stability now amplified vulnerability. Meanwhile, the world's largest economies began to pull apart, slowly, painfully. Redundancy replaced efficiency. Cost replaced speed. What had been optimized for profit now had to be rebuilt for survival. This was not progress. It was damage control on a planetary scale. And beneath it all was the quiet tragedy. This new era had not been forced into existence by an invading army or a sudden collapse. It was born from confidence, from the belief that power could be safely diluted without consequence. The catastrophe was not that a rival rose. It was that the world had been reshaped in a way that made confrontation inevitable. The order did not fall overnight. It simply stopped holding. History is unforgiving to superpowers that confuse dominance with permanence. The lesson here is not that openness is a mistake or that engagement is naive by definition. It is something colder and far more unsettling. When you sit at the center of the system, every decision you make reshapes the future, whether you intend it or not. The United States believed it was managing risk by spreading prosperity. In reality, it was redistributing power without fully accounting for ambition. Economics did not erase strategy. It amplified it. Markets did not neutralize rivalry. They provided new terrain on which it could thrive, unseen. This is the danger of strategic innocence. Not moral innocence, but the belief that your own logic is universal, that others will chase comfort instead of control, that growth naturally leads to convergence. These assumptions feel reasonable when you are winning. They feel catastrophic only after the balance has shifted. No empire collapses the moment it makes its first mistake. It collapses when those mistakes compound, when short-term gain is repeatedly chosen over long-term leverage, and when warning signs are dismissed because correcting course would be too disruptive. Power is rarely lost through defeat. More often it is loaned out piece by piece until reclaiming it becomes impossible. The lesson is simple and brutal. There are no neutral choices for a hegemon. Every open door is a potential weapon. Every act of generosity carries strategic weight. And every rival is patient enough to wait for you to forget that. There is a temptation, at the end of every great historical mistake, to believe it was unique, that the conditions were special, the actors exceptional, the outcome unavoidable. This is how empires soothe themselves, but history does not comfort. It warns. What happened here was not an accident in the ordinary sense. It was the result of confidence left unchecked, of power exercised without imagination for its consequences. The United States did not lose a war. It won so completely that it forgot what rivalry actually looks like. And in that moment of certainty, it began shaping a future it would later fear. The most unsettling part is not that this rival exists. It is that the blueprint is now visible. The method is proven: influence without invasion, control without conquest, patience weaponized into strategy. These are not tools reserved for one nation or one era. They are available to anyone willing to think long enough and wait quietly enough. So here's the final question, and it is not about the past. It is about now. If this is how the last rival was created, ask yourself what is being built today under the same assumptions. Which doors are open in the name of efficiency? Which dependencies are dismissed as temporary? Which warnings are being ignored because they are inconvenient? History rarely repeats itself exactly, but it remembers the shape of our mistakes. And when the rhythm returns, it does not ask permission.